Good evening and shalom, and welcome to this episode here at the Watchdog. I am your host, CJ Cox, and thank you for joining me here tonight. I did go ahead and skip the intro that we've been doing on our last few episodes, simply because I'm a little bit pressed for time. It's due to my own personal procrastination, I'm not going to lie. But long story short, it takes a very long time to do that small amount of editing. I didn't want to post this tomorrow. I wanted to post it tonight. Even still, it's probably not going to be posted until, technically tomorrow, because it'll probably be, midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning. So technically this is a Tuesday episode if it does end up actually being date stamped for Wednesday. But nonetheless, because of that being pressed for time, I just went ahead and skipped all that and made sure that we could just go straight to uploading this video right onto YouTube. So I apologize for that if people are, looking forward to that for some reason. Let's go right into the discussion we're going to have for today. The pre-article discussion that I decided to have for today is actually what we allow our leaders to get away with. Recently, and by recently, I do mean the last couple years, as well as in the last couple of months in particular, not only just Americans, but really people all over the Western world have ended up picking very poor leaders, morally speaking, just people who are not morally upright. They don't have any honor. They don't have any loyalty. They're not people who keep their promises or who take care of their own families or things like that, right? And these are the people, both on the left and the right, that a lot of us have ended up putting our trust in. And for those of you who may have watched The Watchdog years back when we first started here, we've actually been kind of harping on this for a minute. I say we because at the time, my buddy Matt Hasselbauer and another friend of mine, Logan Gearhart, were actually members of the show as well. And we actually uploaded only on Facebook there. So you can watch them on Facebook. You wouldn't be able to find them here on YouTube. Nonetheless, not the point. But the point is, we were always harping on the fact that, Donald Trump basically was a sacrifice on the conservatives' part of the moral high ground when it came to social and cultural issues, because they were basically saying when Bill Clinton does, etc., and Anthony Weiner does, etc., and Katie Hill does, etc., it's bad. But since we ideologically agree with Donald Trump, now it's irrelevant, and we're just, we're not looking for a pastor, we're looking for somebody to do a job, as many would say. And I always had a problem with that, because it seems to me like that is not only very hypocritical, but it is, in the end, something that is going to be thrown back in your face. If you wanted, for example, if Kamala Harris or Pete Buttigieg were to actually be, or Joe Biden, actually, even right now with the Tara Reade allegations, were to be the Democratic nomination, right? And you bring up, whatever it is. In the case of Joe Biden, it's Tara Reade. In the case of Kamala Harris, it's her affair with the San Francisco mayor. In the case of Pete Buttigieg, right, a lot of people would question his homosexuality and so on and so forth, right? Liberals would always just be able to throw right back in your face, okay, but you literally elected Donald Trump, so I don't understand why you think I'm going to take you seriously on this. And it's a very real problem. It's a problem that manifests itself more and more as time goes on. The thing with that, though, is another thing that ends up happening on top of the fact that it's just not politically pragmatic, nor is it morally good to do such a thing. It's actually very hypocritical. But it has developed this sort of childish and amoral mentality blatantly in a lot of our politicians. And I'm not going to say it's never happened before, because it certainly has. People who are history buffs, of course, would know Andrew Jackson and John Quincy Adams were not fond of each other. They were not nice to each other. They were very insulting, and they definitely both lied about each other frequently. But, to go both in Britain and in the United States and give some examples of what's happened just recently, right? We've seen Donald Trump and Nancy Pelosi going back and forth, calling each other just these ridiculous fourth grade playground kind of insults, right? Rather than actually discussing the political issues. We've seen the Prime Minister of Britain, and in the case of Donald Trump and Boris Johnson, these are people who are supposed to be conservative, and I even like a lot of Boris Johnson's policies, right? But here we have a man who abandoned his first wife, who's now having a child out of wedlock, right? So on and so forth. He's a person who frequently drinks and is very insulting, and so on and so forth, right? Jeremy Corbyn, of course, was the one opposing him. He's literally an anti-Semite, right? A very evil man. We have people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar who commit immigration fraud or campaign finance fraud, right, on the one end, while, of course, I just mentioned Donald Trump, but many other people. Don Blankenship, for example, who's actually moved to the Constitution Party at this point. I'm very, very disappointed to say, right? Somebody who is allegedly representative of the conservative position, right? And as much as I even enjoyed at the time, rather hypocritically, I'll be honest, I definitely should not have, people like Milo Yiannopoulos, right? While I enjoyed what they would do because it was kind of, giving the liberals a taste of their own medicine kind of thing. In the end, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Is somewhere along the lines, everybody on all the different sides has kind of just accepted that we are going to allow ourselves to be represented, excuse me, by horribly amoral, disloyal, whether, sexually perverse, violent, greedy, dishonest, etc. individuals, and that we weren't even going to ask them to hide it, but that they could just do it constantly, that they could be childish, that they could decide policy over Twitter and things like that. And of course, one of the things that we've also frequently pointed out on the show is the fact that in the end, Donald Trump was kind of a mirror of what liberalism had actually turned into and what progressivism had actually turned into, right? He, goes off on Twitter rants and insults people. They go off on Twitter rants and insult people. He's got a huge social media presence and is a celebrity. A lot of them are as well. He's a billionaire. Well, all of the richest people in America, Zuckerberg, Gates, Buffett, Dorsey, etc. Dorsey's like not one of the richest, but he is a billionaire, right? Bloomberg, so on and so forth. They're liberal Democrats, right? So he was, in a lot of ways, he was a mirror of them. But the fact that people like Donald Trump and people like Boris Johnson and so on and so forth, right, have been accepted by the right means there's no longer a side that is actually defending moral social fabric in the United States and of America and in Britain. And of course, this is happening in a lot of places elsewhere as well. The Le Pens in France, although, I do agree with a lot of things that Marie Le Pen believes, and I definitely do appreciate her trying to distance herself from some of the more anti-Semitic factions of her party that were influenced by her own father. That must have been hard to do. That being said, she definitely is somebody who is anti-Muslim in the bad way, right? There's a lot of ways you can be anti-Muslim. There's a lot of ways you really should be anti-Muslim. You should be anti-Muslim in your polemics, right? Because it's just a false religion. You should be anti-Muslim in the sense that you don't want Islamic law and Sharia law in the United States. And into all of those ways, absolutely, that there is room for a level of what you would term in the media anti-Muslim sentiment, although in reality it's just against what we would term as a political version of Islam, although, that's a completely different topic in and of itself. Some would argue they're inseparable. Not the point. The point is, they kind of go a little bit farther than that. Things like, burqa bans and wanting to actually have, bans on immigration, from certain Muslim countries because they're Muslim countries, and, giving them like name tags and stuff like that, the way that the Nazis did with the Jews, which I'm not comparing them to the Nazis. They're not systematically slaughtering anybody. I'm just saying that is one of the things that the Nazis did, right? And these are not good things, right? These are definitely not good things. These are things that, on top of just being very bad for things like human liberty, human decency, and the community, they're just moral, right? Or immoral, rather, right? It's immoral to take a certain religious group and start to oppress them, right? Even if you do disagree with their religion, and in a lot of very key fundamental ways. Of course, we think jihad is evil and things like that, right? But that's not the point. The point is, if you want to still claim moral high ground, you can't stoop to their level, or stoop to the level of the jihadis to be a little bit more peaceable, if you will, to the moderate Muslim who may be in the audience. You can kind of continue on with all of the different leaders through the Western Hemisphere, through the Western nations. I guess it's not really the Western Hemisphere, although technically it is. Even people who we've traditionally trusted quite a bit, like, for example, Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu started allowing some things that are not very good. Things like the, racial discrimination against Ethiopian Jews. Things like the religious rabbinate being allowed to persecute in small ways, which, of course, small ways always evolve into big ways. Messianic Jews and Karaite Jews and so on. Whether it's arresting people who are immigrating there because they happen to have different political views, even though by the laws of the basic laws of Israel, they definitely classify as somebody who is allowed to immigrate, no questions asked, right? And so on and so forth. And of course, you have his bribery charges. They may or may not be true. I got to be honest, I kind of think they are. I don't think he would be so scared of going to trial if it wasn't the case. It's just my own personal opinion. Maybe I'm wrong, right? But nonetheless, we're seeing, like I'm saying, on all different sides, this sort of, well, morality be damned so long as he agrees with me and does the things that I want, whether that's people being anti-Semitic, or people being overly anti-Muslim, or people being caught up in bribery, or people having sexual allegations, like assaults, or, the whole grabbing by the P word and all that other kind of stuff, right? Or what have you. It just goes down the line, and it's on the right, and it's on the left, and it's in multiple countries all across the world, and I just think it's a problem. I think it's a problem. I think the United States of America, which is my own country, needs to fix this problem, because it's not okay. We should not have philanderers and liars and greedy conmen, right, and people who have been convicted of fraud in a court of law and etc., representing us, at least not without some very obvious examples that they have had significant moral changes, personal changes, actually, changes that affect their entire life, not just their public image. And I very much worry about the state of the United States because of that. But nonetheless, it's been 11 minutes now, so we want to get into the articles. Enough of my ranting. Let's just go straight into it. We might not even be able to get to all of them because of my ranting. Federal court backs California Governor Gavin Newsom's orders keeping churches closed. Now, of course, this is very interesting for a lot of progressives, I'm sure, because about 2 months ago they were saying this isn't a persecution of Christians in particular. It targets everybody. And of course, the response at the time would have been that even if it doesn't target one group in particular, it can still oppress them if fundamental rights are taken away from them as a result of it. For example, when Christians were slaughtered in the ancient Roman Empire, a lot of times it was not because of laws specifically targeting Christians. Rather, it was people who just weren't following the Roman gods and wouldn't confess Caesar as Lord, right? So, of course, they could have used that to say, well, we're not specifically targeting Christians by the progressive logic of the modern day, and that would have allowed them to get away with literal torture and murder. Excuse me. But now, fast forward a little bit, and people are starting to be allowed to open up, right? A lot of barbershops, a lot of, recreational areas, so on and so forth. Of course, it's already been very well established by a lot of people, both liberal and conservative governors, unfortunately. And, I put conservative in quotation marks, though I guess you can't see that because you got the article up on your screen, who have decided that going to the liquor store and going to buy some marijuana, or going to the tobacco store, or, even, there was one other big one that I can't really remember, I guess, at the moment. It'll come to me in a minute. But nonetheless, abortion clinics, that's what it was, right? Abortion clinics. They were completely down with keeping these things open, even though they're clearly not essential. But even though it's enshrined in the First Amendment of the Constitution that we have freedom of speech, freedom to assemble, and, of course, the right to practice our religion, they have decided that that is not essential and you cannot do that. Of course, I have been a supporter of Tony Spell and others who have decided, Tim Remington and others, who have decided that we do not want to follow your law in this particular example. God's law trumps it, and God says that we are not to forego fellowship. But nonetheless, the federal courts do not agree with God, nor do they agree with the Founding Fathers, and they have decided, at least the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals has decided, that Gavin Newsom's order keeping churches closed is legitimate. So let's go ahead and read this article. It's from ABC, written by Bill Hutchinson, and we'll just go ahead and jump right in. A federal appeals court has backed California Governor Gavin Newsom's stay-at-home order banning in-church services to blunt the spread of coronavirus, rejecting an argument from clerics that the governor is treading on their First Amendment right to free exercise of their religious beliefs. Now, how anybody could consider themselves a legitimate judge in the United States and agree with what the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals did in this particular case is just, it's mind-boggling to me. I guess you just don't have a concept of contradictions. The Constitution very clearly says you have the free exercise of religion. It also says you have the right to assemble. That's not disputable. If you think that that is disputable, you honestly should not be qualified to be a judge. I think that should be something that immediately disbars you. I know that's how you revoke somebody's right to practice law. I guess I don't know if that necessarily applies to judges, but nonetheless, whatever that is for judges should certainly happen, if that is even remotely a question for you. Anybody who is going to take a position of judge should have to individually, because apparently this is a question, each and every amendment, they should have to sit there and say, yes, I affirm the First Amendment, and I will not tread on anybody's right to religious belief. I affirm. And that way we can actually, hold them accountable. Hey, are you violating people's right to assemble? Are you actually violating people's right to trial by jury? Are you violating people's right to have their firearms and so on and so forth, right? I don't know. I just think it's an idea. But nonetheless, let's just go ahead and move forward. The U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals issued a 2-1 split ruling denying the request... Excuse me, let me restart that. I kind of messed that up. The U.S. Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals issued a split 2-1 ruling denying the request for a temporary restraining order against Newsom's in-church service ban filed this month by the South Bay United Pentecostal Church in Chula Vista, California. I just want to say I do find it interesting that whether it's Oneness Pentecostal or in this case the United Pentecostal, it does seem to be a lot of Pentecostals who are having a problem with this. Although... James White is a Reformed Baptist, and he's had a pretty big problem with this as well. So I guess it's not exclusive to them. And I don't know what Tim Remington's denomination is. It doesn't really matter, because all of the churches should be allowed to open. Nonetheless, we continue. The ruling was issued late on Friday, the same day President Donald Trump demanded governors nationwide allow churches, synagogues, mosques, and other places of worship to reopen immediately. Very good, Trump. Quote, the governors need to do the right thing and allow these very important essential places of faith to open right now for this weekend. If they don't do it, I will override the governors, end quote. Now, I do want to quickly point out, I don't actually think Trump has the constitutional authority to do that. There are certain places of the Constitution I can quote better than others, and so it is entirely possible that my memory fails me in that particular regard. But I am fairly certain the 9th and 10th Amendments would not allow him to do such a thing. Now, I do wonder, because I've actually speculated about this when it comes to the violation of the Second Amendment by Virginia Governor Ralph Northam, right? I do wonder if, since these governors are violating the first 10 amendments of the Constitution, or really any amendment of the Constitution, if the president would actually have the authority to remove them from office on that grounds. I don't really know how else you could protect the liberties of the people if you couldn't actually remove the froward leader, right? And the reason I say that is because, we often talk about every law is enforced at the point of a gun, right? And the reason that is true is because in the end, if, for example, you give me a speeding ticket, I decide not to pay it. So you say you're going to come arrest me, and I decide not to cooperate with the arrest because I think the speeding ticket is illegitimate. Eventually, if I am resisting to the point where you're not actually able to get me and I'm potentially even being violent, you'll tase me, and if the tasing doesn't work, you'll shoot me, right? And if you wouldn't shoot, then in the end, I got away with it. Nothing's going to happen. That's why every law in the end has to be enforced at the point of a gun, because if somebody takes it to the extreme conclusion of I just absolutely will not cooperate, I'm not going to pay, I'm not going to cooperate with the arrest, I'm not going to jail, etc., right? The only other option you have is a firearm. Right? A firearm either to subdue them or even to end their life, right? So if you apply that same rule to the federal government, and I'm not necessarily even claiming I'm comfortable with this idea, because I don't like the idea of the federal government removing, elected officials in states either. It's a weird issue for me. But nonetheless, if you apply that to the federal government's role as the guardian of the liberties that is actually, that are actually laid out in the Constitution, I don't really know how you could achieve that if you don't in the end have any military power against a governor who might decide that he's just not going to cooperate with that. And by the way, there is precedent for this in the past. Ulysses S. Grant, for example, did deploy the United States military in certain southern states like South Carolina and Alabama and etc., who were not allowing black people to vote and were actually violently going out and lynching them and things like that. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I'm going to be honest, I don't really know. I'm going back and forth on it in my own head right now as we speak. But I did just want to note that because, this is something that we can't just, even though I agree with Donald Trump in this, I'm not necessarily sure that he has that power. And in fact, I do think in the end, even though it's a good conversation, I do think in the end he probably does not, nonetheless. I will override the governors, Trump said, as his administration released detailed guidance on how religious institutions can safely reopen amid the virus that has killed nearly 100,000 people and infected more than 1.6 million in the United States. Quote, in America, we need more prayer, not less, end quote. Completely agree with that last statement. As a Christian, I do think that that is the best thing America could do, is be in the good graces of God. Pray and actually mean it. Don't just ask him to come and help with your problems like he's some kind of puppy dog, right? But nonetheless, one thing I do want to point out, 100,000 people killed. If the numbers can be trusted, you can see previous episodes of our own show, as well as Dr. Erickson's video, Plandemic, numerous other people, Steven Crowder has reported on this, etc., Deborah Birx, even, of the White House COVID task force, right? There's substantial evidence to suggest that you cannot trust the numbers. 75% is probably the number that we can trust so far. What I mean by that is, out of this 100,000 people, it's likely that 75,000 have died. But more than once, the number 25% inflation on the death numbers has come out. And that is from people who are experts like Deborah Birx, or people who are politicians like the governor of Colorado. It seems to be Governor of Colorado is a Democrat. People like the representative here in Idaho, Tim Remington, and Heather Scott, another representative, they are Republicans, so it seems to be on both sides of the aisle. And with that, that's an important thing to note, because in 2018 we did have 81,000 flu deaths, and the flu does typically last around 13 weeks as far as the really heavy flu season. In other words, it does appear that COVID is actually not just a flu necessarily. It's a little bit more severe than the flu, but it is honestly just a little bit more severe than more severe than the flu. And I think that's something we need to be aware of, because these people, these experts, quote unquote, and their models were incorrect. And they decided to go out of their way to destroy our economy, to violate our liberties, etc., over models that were flat out false. And this is the warning we've been giving to you guys constantly about climate change, right? These people are never right. They're never right. They are literally never right. They couldn't predict the weather tomorrow, right? So why on earth should we trust them? We should continue to trust people to do what they are going to do, trust liberty, right? And see where that takes us, because that is the way the Founding Fathers set up this country in the first place. We should not trust people just because they have a PhD and saw patients 30 years ago or 20 years ago, however long it's been since Fauci actually saw patients, and who make predictions that are constantly wrong. They're constantly wrong. They're literally never right, as a matter of fact. But nonetheless, let's go ahead and continue on here with this article. I think this is a very important story here in the news, because it just goes to show that there are a lot of power-hungry politicians. And by the way, Brad Little here in Idaho is one of them, so it is definitely both Republicans and Democrats, as Jesse Ventura would say. There's a lot of politicians out there who have an agenda, and that agenda is that they want to, megamaniacally inflate their own ego and their own power and their own self-worth. But nonetheless, we continue. Excuse me. It is unclear what legal authority the president has to overrule the governor, and the White House could not cite a specific provision that would give Trump that power. In its ruling in the California case, the federal appellate judges who sided with Newsom found the state's actions of shuttering houses of worship due to a health emergency does not infringe upon or restrict practices because of their religious motivation, and does not in a selective manner impose burdens only on conduct motivated by religious beliefs. So essentially their argument is, number one, doesn't infringe upon or restrict practices because of their religious motivation, right? In other words, they're saying we restrict numerous things. We're not saying, hey, because you practice such and such a ideology, in this case religion, we are going to shut you down. And then the other thing they're saying, it's not in a selective manner imposing burdens only on conduct motivated by religious belief. In other words, these burdens are going to be imposed on people who barber, on people who are opening bars, etc. Although, in a lot of instances, that's not actually being the case. Of course, in a lot of instances, it is. I personally, once again, want to go back to that example with the Caesar in ancient Rome. If the Caesar in ancient Rome were to say, we're not restricting practices because of their religious motivation, but because of their political motivation, people need to be submissive to the Caesar, right? Which in the end was his argument, although it was kind of religious in nature. Or if he was to say, we're not imposing burdens only on conduct motivated by religious belief, which of course would end up being true. Any sort of political or criminal belief that disrupted the order and would not submit to the established Roman authorities would be guilty of these treasonous acts, right? If he were to say those things, it would be the exact same argument that these people are making, but it doesn't change the fact that he would be throwing Christians to lions, right? Now, of course, they are not throwing Christians to lions right now. I want to make myself perfectly clear. But the point is, these reasons don't actually deal with the key problem here, which is that I have been given the right by my Creator, as enshrined in the Constitution in this nation that is supposed to be the law of the land, right? But nonetheless, I have been given the right to assemble and to practice my religion without infringement, right? And that is being violated at this point in time. And it doesn't matter if your motivations were to tamper down on my religious belief or if the burdens are strictly imposed on religious figures, or religious bodies rather, right? What matters is, are my liberties being violated, yes or no? And the answer is yes. Nonetheless, we continue. Quote, we're dealing with a highly contagious and often fatal disease for which there's presently no known cure, end quote. The same could be flu, kind of just gave up to what I was about to say there. The same can be said of the flu. Thinking a little bit too fast, but nonetheless. Judges Jacqueline Wynn and Barry Silverman, wrote in their ruling denying the restraining order. What they wrote, just to be clear, just messing up all my words now. What they wrote, just to be clear, is, quote, we're dealing here with a highly contagious and often fatal disease for which there is presently no known cure, right? As if that somehow justifies the violation of our liberties as enshrined in the United States Constitution. But whatever. I mean, I forgot the part where Thomas Jefferson and George Washington and etc. added an asterisk saying, yeah, but except that one time when you guys are going to be super scared of this virus, that's actually not that bad. In reaching its decision, the judges noted that the late U.S. Supreme Court Justice Robert Jackson once wrote that if a court does not, quote, does not temper its doctrine, quote, does not oh my goodness. One more time, my apologies, friends. Quote, does not temper its doctrinaire logic with a little practical wisdom, it will convert the Constitutional Bill of Rights into a suicide pact. Just kind of have to disagree, to be honest with you. Your definition of practical wisdom, in its sense, it is certainly objective. Don't get me wrong. What is wise is definitely objectively wise. It is not wise to go stand in front of a truck, and that is an objective fact. However, human beings do not necessarily always adhere to objective facts, right? And since human beings make the laws, what you consider practical wisdom and what somebody else might consider practical wisdom aren't going to be the same thing. For example, they say common sense gun control. Well, common sense according to whom? Because in my opinion, common sense gun control is none at all. Common sense gun control is teaching people how to use firearms properly and making sure that it is definitely a cultural thing where people are expected to have one, right? Because it is just a matter of fact, where there is more firearms, where there is more people who know how to use those firearms, and where those firearms are more evenly distributed amongst the populace, crime goes down, as do things like police shootings and things like that, because it's very dangerous to tyrannize these people. It also happens to be the reason that we weren't invaded by Japan, fun fact. But, the point being, little practical wisdom and common sense are basically interchangeable terms, but I don't agree on what you are claiming in this particular instance is a little practical wisdom or common sense. Common sense and wisdom are certainly things that are objective in their nature, but human beings are very bad at recognizing things which are objective in their nature because we're very subjective in our nature, right? And that is the reason why we have a constitution in the first place. It is not meant to be interpreted. It is meant to dictate the way it is supposed to go, right? That is the entire point. But nonetheless, Newsom issued his stay-at-home order on March 19th, closing all non-essential businesses and barring large gatherings that health officials say could fuel the spread of the contagion. On Wednesday, the second phase of Newsom's plan to restart the economy kicked in, allowing the reopening of many of California's retail businesses, office buildings, restaurants, and shopping centers. Members of house worship are not allowed to congregate until the plan's third phase begins, which will also allow the reopening of hair salons, nail salons, barbershops, gyms, movie theaters, and sporting events without live audiences. Which, I mean, what's the point of a sporting event without a live audience, right? But nonetheless, and why can you go to a movie theater and not a sporting event? That doesn't make any sense. But whatever. Excuse me. Newsom has been vague on when Phase 3 will begin, of course he has, saying earlier this month that it's, quote, quote, is not a year away, it's not 6 months away, it's not even 3 months away, it may not even be more than a month away, end quote. So, I mean, I guess we'll see, right? If it ends up being the case that in less than a month from this day, which, to be fair, this article was published on May 23rd, it is currently May 26th, but nonetheless, we'll see, right? I mean, that's all you can really say is we'll see. On Friday, he announced that state officials are working with faith leaders and experts, and expect to release guidelines on Monday on how churches can reopen. Quote, we look forward to churches reopening in a safe manner, end quote, Newsom said. Leaders of the South Bay United Pentecostal Church filed an emergency motion on Saturday asking the U.S. Supreme Court to overturn the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals ruling. I certainly hope they take that case, and I certainly hope they overturn it, even if it takes them too long to actually do it and everything's already gone back to normal, because the precedent is just not okay. But nonetheless, quote, Governor Newsom would apparently rather litigate this case, quote, Governor Newsom would apparently rather litigate this case all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court than allow, a single Californian to go to church, end quote. Charles Lamandry, a lawyer for the Freedom of Conscious Defense Fund, who is representing the church and its bishop, Arthur Hodges III, said in a statement, quote, under the governor's edicts, Bishop Hodges can bump shoulders with congregants at a shopping mall, but he can't minister to them in a safe and sanitary church sanctuary. This is blatant religious discrimination, and we hope the Supreme Court agrees, end quote. By the way, a thought occurs. A way that you could get around this is start street preaching, because you are allowed to go outside, and start preaching in grocery stores and things like that, because so long as the company will actually keep you there, which I guess a lot of them wouldn't, you are allowed to speak there. It's legal, so that's a thought. But nonetheless, the Supreme Court is yet to announce whether it will hear the case. And once again, I certainly do hope that they will hear this case. I think this is absolutely crucial in the fight for American liberty, and indeed human liberty, because in reality, we are the freest country in the entire world. That's just a non-disputable fact. You may not like that fact. You may want us to appreciate other cultures more. I do definitely appreciate other cultures, I assure you, but that does not mean that objective facts need to be denied. Okay, we are the freest country in the entire planet. We are the most prosperous country in the history of the world, and this is the best place to live, bar none. America, deal with it. Anyways, moving on to our next article. COVID Pass. UK introduces digital health passport to monitor travel and health of population. And of course, this is happening in numerous places across the world. It is not just happening in the UK. In our previous episode last week, we reported to you guys this happening in Washington. We will probably, on Thursday's episode, be reporting to you, unfortunately, that it's happening here in the state of Idaho as well, although I can guarantee you that at least one person in Idaho, and that will be me, is going to refuse this. There's just absolutely no way that I'm going to cooperate with being tracked. It's just not going to happen. And you shouldn't allow it either. But nonetheless, UK introduces digital health passport to monitor travel and health of population. And of course, why are they sitting here tyrannizing us? Well, it's simple, really, because they're tyrants. They're tyrants. It's in their nature. They can't help themselves. They can't help themselves. They hate you and everyone else. You know what I mean? Like, it's the facts. They just hate humanity in total, right? They hate liberty. They hate prosperity. They hate it when human beings flourish. They want to be in control of everything. If human beings do flourish, they want it to be on their terms. And you see this constantly. This is by Jamie White from InfoWars, published May 26th, so that is actually today. Probably yesterday when you guys see this, because like I said, it'll probably end up being Wednesday. The UK government is preparing to roll out a new digital health passport to monitor nearly every aspect of citizens' lives in the name of strengthening public health management. And of course, the UK government is the same government that murdered Charlie Gard in cold blood, and Alfie Evans in cold blood, that consistently puts Tommy Robinson in prison on trumped-up charges. Some of these charges being things like recording outside of a court case. This is the same British government, of course, that has limited people's ability to own televisions without some sort of a license, or bleach without some sort of a license, right? Which has limited their ability to have cars in certain neighborhoods, and guns and knives and things of that nature, which has dragged its feet on the Brexit issue, even though a referendum was actually voted on in 2015. 2015! That was 5 years ago. We finally had the Brexit happen this year. It's the one good thing Boris Johnson has done so far. And so, the UK government is just really acting in its own nature at this particular point. This is not something we should be shocked by any stretch of the imagination, right? And quite frankly, the UK government is an evil government. But nonetheless, we move forward. And by the way, I'd just like to point out, it's an evil government that is headed by, allegedly, conservatives. They had their largest victory, I think, ever, if I'm not mistaken, in the last election. Boris Johnson is, of course, the prime minister, so on and so forth. But nonetheless, we continue. British cybersecurity firm VST Enterprises, in partnership with the UK government, developed an application called Covipass to track, quote, your COVID-19 test history and immunoresponse and other relevant health information, end quote, using a proprietary matrix code called a V code. The Covipass website bills the tech as, quote, the world's most secure digital health passport built on patented technology, awarded the Seal of Excellence by the European Commission, and being used by various United Nations projects, end quote. Neither one of those things are things I trust. I just got to be honest with you. I don't trust the EU under any circumstances, and I don't trust the UN under any circumstances. So telling me that those two people are the people who endorse it is basically like telling me, hey, try this pill. The Nazis endorsed this pill specifically for Jewish people. It's like, yeah, you know what? I don't believe that particular recommendation. I got to be honest with you. Something fishy about that. Nonetheless, the V code itself is described as an end-all tech that can be, the V code itself is described as an end-all tech that can store every sensitive detail about your life using military-grade encryption software. Yes, every sensitive detail about your life using military-grade encryption software. Because science fiction is just not a thing anymore. Dystopian novels are just the way that we operate in our political climate these days. Quote, assign any form of information to your own V code securely. Your V code can store anything from identity details in case of emergency information, health records, payment methods, car registration numbers, business card details, social media links, and much more, all from the same code, end quote. Let's just go through that one more time. Quote, assign any form of information, right, to your V code securely. Your V code can store anything from identity details, right? Those are going to be things like your name, your social security number, where you live, etc. In case of emergency information, your health records, your payment methods, like your card information and your banking information, and etc. Your car registration numbers, your business card details, your social media links, and even the ambiguous much more, right? If that does not terrify you, then quite frankly, you're already lost, right? I think the rest of us here who are, maintaining a small ounce of sanity are looking at this saying, this is like Revelation 666 kind of stuff, right? And quite frankly, I wouldn't be surprised if at some point something similar to this ends up being the fruition of that prophecy, but that's a subject for unapologetics. I mean, this is terrifying stuff, man. They're making codes to record all of your information. They're trying to track you using things like your cell phone and etc. They're putting drones in the air in your backyard and in the streets to bark orders at you like you're some kind of slave, right? That they're limiting your ability to congregate, to go and, assemble and protest against them and vote even. I mean, we are in a weird dystopian timeline right now. Like, it got weird with the election of Donald Trump and how, like, that just seemed to throw everything into whack. But, like, 2020 and COVID has made everything much weirder than I think a lot of us expected. But to be fair, not all of us were not expecting this. I think on this show and on Alex Jones' show and on Steven Crowder's show and on Gavin McKinnis' show and on a lot of people's shows, Mark Dice, for example, people have warned about this kind of thing happening. And the thing that people need to realize, right, is even though there is definitely an ideology, i.e. globalism, that certainly is a driving ideology in this just crackdown, vicious crackdown on human freedom. The other thing you have to remember is all ideologies, or at least most ideologies, are susceptible to this problem because it's the nature of human beings, right? We just simply are tyrants. And that is why it is very difficult. It takes very strong men, even in positions where they don't have a lot of power, like the president, comparatively to the king, right? It takes very strong men, in a lot of cases godly men, to lead without actually going overboard and stepping on people's toes. And even then, usually you do eventually, right? George Washington eventually committed acts that we would consider to be unconstitutional. For example, the whiskey tax that he signed into law. He even ended up recognizing that himself as an undue burden on the people. You couldn't recognize a flaw of yours if you didn't have a flaw, right? Thomas Jefferson also. John Adams, also, and his son. And James Madison, and James Monroe, and so on and so forth. It's just the nature of human beings. And when you have human beings who are unchecked by God, who are unchecked by something like a constitution, who are unchecked by any sense of coherent moral philosophy, right, then you end up having people who basically end up embodying Nietzsche's Übermensch, right, or like Overman, I think is how that actually translates. But basically the ultimate man, right? In the sense that they, quote unquote, throw off the shackles of traditional living and traditional moralism and just build the world in their own image. And the thing is, their own image is almost always terrible. And actually, scratch that. It is always objectively terrible. All of the time. Human beings, none of them that have ever existed, barring the one who was the God human being, and I talk, of course, of Jesus Christ, none of them are capable of building a world in their image. We are flawed. We are evil in our very core. And that's not just a Christian belief, by the way. That's a cynic belief, a stoic belief, a humanist belief in a lot of instances, a Confucian belief in a lot of instances, a Buddhist belief, a Muslim belief, a Jewish belief. It's something that we typically agree on because it's so obviously the case. Human beings even term things like this in philosophy the absurd because we recognize just how inherently terrible life and indeed humans and indeed nature actually is. We're not capable of building things in our own image, and we never will be. And we're not capable of building things on some sort of image we're going to get from nature because nature is horrible, and so on and so forth. That is why we need to be bound by coherent moral philosophy, by coherent political philosophy, and most importantly, at least in my opinion, by Jesus Christ. But I do think, once again, that is an issue for an unapologetics. But nonetheless, I do think you are seeing, people declaring, like Nietzsche did, God's not dead, and as a result, they become Nietzsche's Übermensch. The problem with that is it's not a good thing like Nietzsche thought. It's actually something that is very terrible. It's very frightening. The company states that the technology will allow people to go back to work safely, suggesting the technology could be mandatory in order to return to work. You heard that correctly. Mandatory in order to return to work. Now, what is that the Revelation says? Wouldn't be able to buy or sell. Getting kind of close to that. Nonetheless, getting off of the biblical topics, because I can't help myself. I just keep going to it. That should frighten you, regardless of your religious doctrine. You an atheist? Good. That should frighten you. You have the right to work regardless of if you've decided to put all of your information in some ridiculous code and then given it to a company that also happens to be in bed with the government. That's ridiculous. It is an obscene violation of liberty. And if that doesn't terrify you, once again, I'm sorry, you're lost at this point. You're already lost. You're on the other side, and unfortunately, I hope that's the wrong side of history. It might end up being, the last side of history. Who knows? If it is something like the Mark of the Beast, then I guess we're just ending history here. But nonetheless, quote, COVID Pass biometrically accessed on a mobile phone or held on a key FOB or RFID, like the RFID chip, provides a unique authenticated gateway for government/health services and businesses to ensure a safe work environment, end quote. I mean, I don't know. I feel like commentary is irrelevant. You know what I mean? The words as they exist are horrifying. And they definitely make me fear for the future of this country. Absolutely. Because either this is going to be successful, in which case we're all going to be tyrannized, or this is not going to be successful, in which case I fear there might be bloodshed. I don't advocate that there be bloodshed, right? I don't want a second American Civil War, but it's just, I get the feeling that is the only way certain groups of people are going to lose, because it seems like the ideology of constitutionalism and the ideology of progressive humanism are just simply not compatible. They will not mix, and they have to come to a boiling point. That's just my personal theory. I hope I'm wrong, but we'll see what happens. Excuse me. A sports marketing company called Red Strike Group is partnering with VST Enterprises to introduce the tech for group sporting events, saying that people will only be able to return to daily life after they've been officially tested. Yes, only be able to return to daily life after you've been officially tested by the filthy rich, controlling all your information, ideologically inconsistent, all-powerful overlords who, of course, are backed up by the experts who can never possibly be wrong. Peace be upon them. Quote, Red Strike Group and its partner, Manchester-based cybersecurity firm VST Enterprises, is delivering groundbreaking digital passport solutions to governments, healthcare organizations, sports federations, leagues, and clubs around the world. The VCode Digital Health Passport enables individuals who have been officially tested to start returning to work and daily activities in a safe and secure environment, end quote. By the way, doesn't that sound a little bit, not only like the RFID chip that they keep trying to put, in fact, they've already referenced the RFID chip that they keep trying to put in credit cards and whatnot, but doesn't that sound a little bit like the Star card that they want to push in this country, October 1st, 2020, coming very soon to a city near you, right? Where they're going to force you, if you want to enter a federal building or if you want to fly commercially, to actually have a passport or a Star card with a little chip in it, right? Sounds very similar to that, right? It's almost like they've been planning this for a long time, and COVID just happened to give them the opportunity to, play on people's fears and push forward what they always wanted to push forward in the first place. I don't know, just a thought. As we reported last month, depopulation czar Bill Gates touted immunity passports as a means of contact tracing the U.S. population in order to reopen the economy, and of course that has been shown in numerous other instances. The companies Apple and Google, the governors, Brad Little and Jay Inslee of Washington and Idaho, and numerous others, Anthony Fauci, so on and so forth. Quote, an even better solution would be the broad, voluntary adoption of digital tools, end quote, wrote in, I think they mean Bill Gates wrote in the Washington Post. Quote, for example, there are apps that will help you remember where you have been. If you ever test positive, you can review the history or choose to share it with whoever comes to interview you about your contacts, end quote. Quote, and some people have proposed allowing phones to detect other phones that are near them by using Bluetooth and emitting sounds that humans can't hear. I mean, I didn't make the quote up. The quote is there, right? That is what it says. One more time, to detect other phones, allowing phones to detect other phones that are near them by using Bluetooth and emitting sounds that humans can't hear. So that everybody knows where you are and you know where everybody else is. And by the way, even if the governments aren't evil with it, which they definitely are, but even if they weren't, there's no way at all that criminals could ever misuse this. It's just not possible, you conspiracy theorist. Listen to your experts. Peace be upon them. If someone tested positive, their phone would send a message to the other phones, and their owners could get tested. If most people chose to install this kind of application, it would probably help some, end quote, and that's the end of the article. And by the way, these are the same people that think that it should not be law for you to tell people whether or not you have AIDS or another STD before you have sex with them. So, back to that ideological inconsistency. But whatever, right? Who cares about that? All we care about is fighting COVID-19, my dude. And if you don't care about fighting COVID-19, you, hate grandma, bro. Anyways, I hate this, and I'm done with this. So we're going to talk about other things that I hate, and I'm going to be done with in a few minutes. InfoWars, once again. This is, once again, Jamie White. I actually kind of dig Jamie White a lot. She's probably my favorite writer at InfoWars at this point. Nonetheless, Ilhan Omar said that she would vote for Biden even if he did sexually assault Tara Reade. Because, morality is completely irrelevant when you want political power. It's just kind of the way it goes. The fact that you didn't know that, you naive, silly, moral person, is just pathetic, quite frankly. Of course, I'm being facetious. Nonetheless, Representative Ilhan Omar, a Democrat from Minnesota, declared that she would still vote for presumptive Democrat nominee Joe Biden, despite the fact that she believes his sex assault accuser Tara Reade. Now, you might think that's just a right-wing talking point. She didn't say that. There's no way. They're misconstruing her words. They're not actually going to show the quote. She didn't say that. This is fake news, blah, 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 right? Well, let's continue. Let's see if that's true. Omar was asked in an interview with Good Morning America Tuesday about previous comments she made saying she believed Reade's story saying that Biden sexually assaulted her in 1993. Quote, there's obviously parts of what she said, quote, one more time, there's obviously parts of what she said that have been corroborated, and parts that haven't. So there are parts parts of what she said, obviously, right? Which means that it's not even really disputable, rather. There are parts that have definitely, obviously, without doubt, been corroborated. That's what she's saying. Quote, I think it's important when someone says they have been assaulted and they see themselves as survivors that we, as we have been saying, believe survivors. So she said it's important that we believe survivors. And by the way, faulty logic here, she said that we should believe them because they view themselves as survivors, not because they actually are survivors. Because, logic and facts be damned. She added that she's going to vote for Biden anyway. Because, quote, this is one of the most important elections of our lifetime, end quote. Adding that, quote, it's important for us to create a space where we allow for survivors to come forward. And that has been consistent with my values, and I think we can do both, end quote. So we can both vote for Joe Biden, who we believe sexually assaulted a woman, and foster a society where women feel comfortable about coming forward about their sexual assault. And I want to create like a meme of me with my head just breaking because I don't even know how to respond to this level of just blatant hypocrisy and dishonesty and frankly stupidity. I mean, either on her part because she potentially believes this, right? Maybe she's not trying to be maliciously evil, although somehow I very much doubt that. But definitely by the people who are going to explain this away. How stupid can you be? Yeah, I know Ted Bundy murdered 10 women and raped them, but I kind of agree with his policy on legalizing marijuana or some other stupid thing. I mean, it's hard to believe that this stuff is actually in the news. Like I said, we are without doubt in the strangest timeline that could have possibly existed. There's this YouTuber named Ryan George. He has these videos that he does these skits. The future is stupid. Yeah, the future is stupid. Absolutely. The future is freaking dumb, man. Anyway, strangely, Omar held the opposite view when Justice Brett Kavanaugh was accused of sexual assault in 2018 by Christine Blasey Ford. In 2018, asserting that Kavanaugh should not... that was a typo. She'd put in 2018 twice. But nonetheless, asserting that Kavanaugh should not be confirmed to the Supreme Court simply because he was accused of sexual assault. Notably, there was more corroborating evidence present in Biden's particular case than there was with Kavanaugh, who still was not even established to have ever met Blasey Ford. And in the sense that it is true that there was a complaint against Joe Biden issued by Tara Reade, that statement is true. There is more corroborating evidence. However, there's a lot of questions about Tara Reade, to be frank. Not least of which is the fact that not only did it take her 40 years in Biden's presumptive nomination as the Democratic candidate for president, right? But she has actually said blatantly that if we find her complaint against Joe Biden, it is not going to include anything about sexual assault or sexual misconduct. So, I don't know that it's fair to believe her without further evidence at this point. I think we do need to be fair to Joe Biden. However, that doesn't mean we can't point out the fact that this is insanely hypocritical. Absolutely ridiculous. This person, Ilhan Omar, is, and she's not the only one, by the way. Other people have said this, like a writer in the New York Times actually said this, and a few others for sure. They're going to vote for Joe Biden anyway, despite the fact that they believe he is a rapist. I mean, you can't make that stuff up. You really can't. Interestingly enough, it was the exact opposite of what I felt about Brett Kavanaugh. I did not want him on the Supreme Court, even though I felt he was not a rapist, because, certain constitutional problems, and I also think he's not really as originalist as people made him out to be. Nonetheless, we continue. Omar said as recent as March that sexual predators Kavanaugh and Justice Clarence Thomas, accused of sexual assault by Anita Hill in 1991, should not have power to adjudicate healthcare policy, because that's somehow relevant. I don't know. Quote, two accused sexual predators should not be deciding whether or not women have access to healthcare in this country, end quote. Omar tweeted, and of course what she means is access to abortions, because she has no soul. And of course I'm kidding, she does have a soul, but she doesn't act like it. This is just the latest example of how hypocrite Democrats don't follow real principles. They simply choose a side that is most politically expedient to get more power. To be fair, that is actually true of the Republicans as well. See no further than the hatred for Bill Clinton having sex with Monica Lewinsky versus what we let Boris Johnson, Donald Trump, Don Blankenship, etc. get away with. That all being said, it is just insane, in my opinion, that we have actually reached a point where people are blatantly admitting, yeah, I think this guy did it. I think he's a rapist. That's definitely true. Also, we should foster a society where people are willing to come forward and talk about these powerful men. But at the same time, I'm going to vote for him to be the most powerful man on the entire planet. Because that makes sense, I guess. That's just brilliant logic. But of course, what more would you expect from the genius representing Minnesota's whatever district? I don't know. Ilhan Omar, right? The brilliant Renaissance girl that she is. Anyways, everything sickens me, I'm not gonna lie. Here's some interesting news, and we'll leave it at this. There's multiple articles I wanted to talk about, but hey, we're gonna be back on Thursday, which technically is gonna be tomorrow for you guys. Not really tomorrow yet, but and we'll talk about those articles then. But nonetheless, James Fairbanks officially charged with first-degree murder of Omaha sex offender. I found this particular case to be interesting, so I wanted to talk about it. This is KETV 7, which is ABC. It's a local news station in Omaha. And by Omaha, I mean Omaha, Nebraska. Right? This is written by, I believe, Emily Tenser is the writer here. There's also this media manager, Chelsea Robinson. But it says that Emily Tenser is the reporter, so I think that would make her the writer. Nonetheless, James Fairbanks was charged Thursday with first-degree murder and use of a deadly weapon to commit a felony. Prosecutors believe 43-year-old James Fairbanks killed Matteo Condalucci, I think is how you say his last name. Condalucci, excuse me, a convicted sex offender. Quote, the state of Nebraska hereby complains to the court that James Fairbanks is alleged to have violated the following laws of the state of Nebraska. On or about May 14, 2020, in Douglas County, Nebraska, James Fairbanks did then and there purposely and with deliberate and premeditated malice kill Matteo Condalucci End quote. A complaint read. Condoleezza's death comes as no surprise to his own daughter, Amanda Henry. Quote, he's hurt so many people and it's a matter of time before somebody did it. End quote, she said. That's rough, man. Like, if your own daughter is saying that it was just a matter of time because he's done so many things to so many people, like, that's rough, you know what I mean? Now, of course, the question here, should James Fairbanks be arrested? And, of course, the answer, and I say, of course, a little bit sarcastically because it's not really obvious at all, but the answer is yes, he should be arrested for this. And I know a lot of you are thinking, you've got to be kidding me. There's no way you believe that. Now, listen, I absolutely believe Condoleezza should have hanged for his crimes, okay? After being found guilty in a court of law by a jury of his peers with proper representation, right? So that we would know beyond any shadow of a doubt in a court of law that he was guilty and then have him be hanged by the state. That is how it should happen. The reason it should not happen... excuse me. The reason it should not happen any other way is because as cool as vigilantism is in movies and books, or vigilantism, however you say that word, right? It's not something that you can allow in basic life, in civilized life, right? In civilized society, because it is almost always used in ways that end up being terrible. Basically, and for many different reasons. For one, it could be that somebody has a different set of values than you, right? And even though the rapist and the prostitute are both committing crimes, maybe one person says, "I'm going to go after the rapist," something you maybe agree with, and another person says, "I'm going to go after the prostitute." And maybe they both put bullets in their heads, and maybe you disagree with that, right? But the thing is the vigilante doesn't, and he's still technically enforcing the law, right? Maybe he has an idea that's completely outside of the law, like religious zealotism, right? Zealotry, sorry. Maybe he got it wrong, right? It seems to be the case that Ahmaud Arbery was not actually committing any crimes when he was murdered by the McDaniels in Georgia, right? Was that malicious intent? Maybe, maybe not. Could be that they just got it wrong. It could also be that the vigilante is racist or sexist or whatever, right? So on and so forth. The thing about police officers, at least the thing that's supposed to be good about police officers, and in many instances this is true, but of course in many instances it's not, they're supposed to be held legally accountable. They have to give a report for their actions, and the organization that is the police department, as well as the judges and the court system and so on and so forth, can actually investigate them and charge them, and they're supposed to be held accountable when they act out of turn. They're even supposed to be held to a higher standard, and that is definitely my belief as well. I think cops should be held to a higher standard than everyone else because they have decided they are going to enforce the law. But nonetheless, you don't have that with vigilantes. So when you have the religious zealot, or the guy with different values than you who's still technically enforcing the law, or the racist or the sexist, or the guy who just got it wrong, or whatever else happens to be out there, there's no way of internally investigating and punishing that person for that wrongdoing, right? So you have to make it a crime. And unfortunately, that does mean that men who are doing what the law should have been doing in the first place do end up getting put in prison. No system can possibly be perfect, but that is because we are dealing with imperfect situations in an imperfect world, right? The thing about a moral dilemma, right, is it would not be a dilemma if you were not stuck between two bad choices. People often give the example, well, if you lie to a Nazi to save some Jews, is that evil? And to be honest with you, the answer, in my opinion, is yes, because morals are absolute and lying is always evil every time, regardless of the reason. It just so happens, however, that it would be more evil to sell out the Jewish people in that particular example, right? But notice the dilemma is not a choice between a good choice and a bad choice. It's a choice between a bad choice and a worse choice, right? And that's the entire reason it's a moral dilemma in the first place. And that is the same way I see this situation. Is it a bad choice to arrest James Fairbanks? Absolutely. Quite frankly, if the Supreme Court wasn't perpetually useless, we would be executing these people By these people, I mean convicted rapists and pedophiles. 1977 and 2003, I believe, is the other one. Two different court cases where the Supreme Court decided that's cruel and unusual punishment, even though these are clearly heinous crimes. But whatever. And on top of that, even if we're not going to be executing these people, the law should at least be imprisoning them. But unfortunately, the law is, like everything the government does, perpetually useless, insignificant, and irrelevant, and they decided they were not going to execute this man. They also decided they were not going to imprison this man. Rather, they were going to do nothing more than put this man on probation and allow him to go about raping children some more. And so it is absolutely terrible that that happened. And as a result, James Fairbanks did what he thinks he needed to do. And I don't blame him, I got to be honest with you. That said, as bad as arresting this man for doing what he did is, the endorsement of vigilantism that comes from not arresting him is not worth it. And it is a horrible situation, but I think that you do have to charge him. Now, the judge has full discretion to go lenient, right? Or to be lenient, rather, on this man. To say, hey, there's minimum sentencing laws or what have you. I guess I don't really know about Nebraska, but we're going to put you here on the minimum sentence and try and help you get out of here. I mean, even though we haven't actually addressed it yet, one thing that we do know, and maybe, when we finish this article, it'll actually mention it. Mr. Fairbanks has cooperated. In fact, he went to the police station and said, hey, I did this, right? So the judge has full discretion to do that, and if I was a judge, I certainly would. But you can't allow vigilantism because, unfortunately, it just leads to so many bad things. So many bad things. But nonetheless, we continue. Investigators believe Fairbanks sent a confession email to KETV Newswatch 7. The email sent to KETV Newswatch 7 from sender Stop Predators said, quote, I killed Matteo Condalusi Thursday, May 14th, end quote. The anonymous sender said he or she had been looking for an apartment in the area when he discovered Condalusi on the Nebraska Sex Offender Registry. The sender described Condalusi as standing in his driveway pretending to wash his truck while staring at a group of children playing in the street. Quote, having had my own experience with these types of predators, I knew, the damage he would do to those kids, end quote, wrote the emailer. Quote, I've worked with kids for years who have been victimized and couldn't, in good conscience, allow him to do it to anyone else while I had the means to stop him, end quote. The emailer also wrote, quote, I know in this messed up judicial system that means I will face far more severe punishment for stopping him than he ever did for raping kids, end quote. And by the way, I do have to agree with him on that. Absolutely, because we should be treating rapists and pedophiles with the utmost contempt as far as the law is concerned. That doesn't mean necessarily that we don't allow people to be rehabilitated. The forgiveness is an interesting question. It's a huge philosophical and also religious question that we're just not going to get into right now. What I will say is it's a personal one-on-one thing. It's not something that the law does, right? Even, like I said, if we weren't going to be executing these people, they still need to be serving prison time long-term for what they have done. They need to be on the sex offender registry for life like they are. That is one of the things I do actually appreciate about what we do, right? There's no way that a man killing a pedophile should be punished longer than the pedophile or harsher than the pedophile. That is an absolute travesty of justice. And I will completely agree with Mr. Fairbanks on that issue. Condalusi was convicted in Sarpy County 13 years ago of sexually assaulting a child. Quote, I've been through so much hurt and pain. There are many times I wanted to do it myself, but I didn't want to give up my freedom, my family, end quote, Henry said. Fairbanks' defense requested a $500,000 bond, arguing he is not a threat and doesn't have a criminal record. However, a judge determined no bond would be set. Still, Steve Leffler and his client his client is still surprisingly upbeat. Quote, normally people are citizens, hate people who have been accused of first-degree murder. This is what makes this a kind of unusual case, end quote, said Fairbanks' attorney. Loeffler said inmates are giving Fairbanks standing ovations. Supporters are sending him money to his jail account and signing petitions to free him, including Condoleezza's daughter. Condoleezza's own daughter. I mean, that's rough, man. Quote, he has tapped into the vein of righteousness that the city of Omaha has, end quote. Loeffler said. That is true to an extent. And, even though it is true that Fairbanks does need to face these charges, hopefully this could reinvigorate some debate about why don't we execute rapists and pedophiles, or at least punish them severely with harsh prison sentences, right? Why don't we do that? Why is it that this man is going to serve a longer prison sentence than the person who he killed for literally raping a child? Because that is a genuinely great question. It's a phenomenal question. And it points out some of the serious ideological consistency of our modern elites. Chief Deputy Douglas County Attorney Brenda Beadle insists premeditated murder will not go unpunished. Of course, she has to say that. Quote, I've said it before and I'll say it again. It's never a good idea to take justice into your own hands. Vigilante justice isn't the answer, end quote, Beadle said. Fairbanks is a paraprofessional with Omaha Public Schools Alternative Middle School program. The district said he's on leave. Kind of already said what I wanted to say, I guess. It's an interesting moral dilemma. It's an interesting question, both for the political theorist and the philosopher, I think. But in the end, I do think we cannot allow vigilantism. Once it is brought to the attention of the law does have to do something about it. And by the way, it's not like this was brought to the attention of a cop and the cop decided to arrest him, or the attorney went out of their way to charge him. He did actually go and admit, what he had done. Much to his credit, actually. Much to his credit. I do think James Fairbanks is a hero. He's certainly a tragic hero in this instance, but he's definitely a hero. And it's weird. The whole situation is weird because really, like I said, you shouldn't allow vigilantism because of everything that it can turn into. But at the same time, this man absolutely is a hero, and he's doing what the law should already be doing. The law, unfortunately, is just terrible. The people who make our laws are terrible. The people who enforce our laws in many instances are terrible. It just so happens that everybody all the time is terrible, and that's just the way that human beings are. So, on that absolutely nihilistic and depressing note, thank you guys for watching. I'm, of course, your host, CJ Cox, and I appreciate your view. If you appreciate this video, think that the content is worthy of other people listening to, please do like and share the content. We greatly do appreciate that. You will find links to all of the articles that we used here in the description below. You will also find links to all of our different social media accounts in the description below, which includes, at this point, the American Cynic Party on Facebook, Terrestrial Earthbird on Twitter, Cynic Thought on Instagram, ACP Official on Gab, TheCynicogue on Minds, TheCynicogue on BitChute, and TheCynicogue on Patreon. Also coming here soon, hopefully, will be a Spotify account, a few accounts on a few different video streaming platforms, and SoundCloud, right? So that we can get this in podcast formation, or in the podcast format, rather. I don't know why I said formation. And just move forward with that. Hopefully that'll be a pretty cool development for the Watchdog. But nonetheless, if you guys like the Watchdog, please do subscribe here. We greatly do appreciate it, to the CynicoUgue. We also have a apologetics program called Unapologetics, and a smaller 30 minutes or less Unapologetics Lite, which can be anywhere from 30 to 10 minutes, or 10 to 30 minutes rather. So if you're interested in Christian apologetics and faith and things like that, you can also subscribe for that, or both, right? Why not both? In the future, we plan to have content both from myself and from others, pertaining not only to issues of politics, economics, religion, and things like that, but also philosophy, science, history, military, and so on and so forth. So Whenever that does happen, of course, hopefully you guys will be around to see it. Nonetheless, if you appreciate this, please do like, please do share, please do subscribe. Questions, comments, criticisms, or concerns down in the bottom. We certainly do appreciate that, and we will interact with anybody who is not trolling. And you guys have a great rest of your day. Shalom.